January the 17th, 1943, Schweinfurt, Germany. The winter air hung thick with the smell of machine oil and scorched metal. In the operations room of Jagdgeschwader 26, a Luftwaffe fighter squadron responsible for defending the Reich's industrial heartland, Major Wilhelm Herget stood before a blackboard covered in hastily scrawled notations. Outside, the rumble of distant explosions echoed across the frozen landscape. American bombers had come again, the third raid in as many weeks. Herget's fingers traced the flight patterns on the map, his jaw tightening as he studied the defensive maneuvers his pilots had attempted that morning. 4 of his men had not returned. The Americans had lost 11 flying fortresses, but still they came. Always they came. The young pilot sitting across from him, Lieutenant Franz Stigler, held a cup of ersatz coffee that had long gone cold. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from exhaustion. He had flown 3 sorties in the past 36 hours, his eyes rimmed red from sleepless nights and the constant strain of high-altitude combat fixed on a crumpled pack of American cigarettes someone had salvaged from a downed bomber. Lucky strike. Even the name carried a kind of brash confidence that seemed uniquely American. Stigler wondered what kind of men flew those massive 4-engine fortresses through walls of flak and swarms of German fighters, knowing that statistically they would not survive their tour of duty. This was the question that haunted the Luftwaffe throughout the air war over Europe. What were these American pilots really made of? In the beginning, in those early months of 1942 and into 1943, the prevailing sentiment among German fighter pilots had been one of professional curiosity, mixed with dismissive confidence. The Americans were untested, inexperienced, products of a soft, materialistic society that valued comfort over sacrifice. German pilots, forged in the crucible of the Spanish Civil War and tempered by 4 years of brutal combat across Europe, Africa, and Russia, considered themselves the aristocracy of aerial warfare. They had shot down the best pilots France and Britain could produce. What challenge could these newcomers possibly present? The early encounters seemed to confirm these assumptions. American bomber formations flew in tight defensive boxes bristling with 50 caliber machine guns, but their tactics were predictable, almost textbook in their rigidity. German fighters exploited gaps in their formations, targeted stragglers, and used superior speed and maneuverability to devastating effect. The skies over occupied Europe became graveyards for flying fortresses and liberators. On October 14, 1943, during what would become known as Black Thursday, the 8th Air Force lost 60 bombers in a single raid on Schweinfurt. 600 men gone in one afternoon. German pilots returned to their bases with kill claims that seemed almost too easy. Yet beneath the surface of these tactical victories, something was shifting. The Americans kept coming. Week after week, month after month, the formations grew larger, the tactics more refined, and most unsettling of all, the pilots themselves began to display qualities that contradicted everything German military doctrine had assumed about them. They were not breaking, they were learning. Oberst Johannes Steinhoff, a Luftwaffe ace who would survive the war with 176 confirmed kills, recorded his impressions in his private journal after encountering American P-47 Thunderbolt fighters for the first time in early 1943. He wrote of being startled by their aggressive tactics, their willingness to dive into swirling dogfights despite being outnumbered. But more than their courage, what struck Steinhoff was their equipment. The Thunderbolt was massive, nearly twice the weight of his Messerschmitt Bf-109, yet it could absorb punishment that would have torn a German fighter apart. He watched, incredulous, as one Thunderbolt he had raked with cannon fire simply rolled away and continued fighting, its pilot seemingly unconcerned by the damage. The engine kept running. The controls still responded. It was as if the Americans had brought an entirely different philosophy to aerial combat, one that valued survivability and material superiority over the elegant minimalism German engineers prized. This realization came with a creeping sense of dread. The Americans were not trying to build better individual warriors. They were building a system that made the individual warrior nearly impossible to kill. Their bombers came equipped with self-sealing fuel tanks, armored crew compartments, and redundant control systems. Their fighters carried enough ammunition to sustain combat for extended periods, and enough fuel to escort bombers deep into German territory. When a German pilot exhausted his 20 seconds of cannon ammunition, he had to break off and return to base. American pilots kept fighting. Major Heinz Knoker, another decorated Luftwaffe fighter pilot, encountered American bomber crews up close after forcing several to land in occupied territory. He expected to meet broken men, shattered by the experience of aerial combat. Instead, he found young men who seemed almost casual about the ordeal they had just survived. They asked for cigarettes, made jokes about their wounds, and displayed what Knoke described as an unsettling nonchalance. One American navigator, his arm in a makeshift sling, asked Knoke if he knew where they could get a decent cup of coffee. Coffee. In the middle of a war zone, having just been shot from the sky, this man's primary concern was caffeine. Knoke found himself wondering if perhaps the Germans had misunderstood what American softness really meant. Perhaps it was not weakness, but rather an abundance so complete that even in the midst of catastrophe, comfort remained an expectation rather than a luxury. The mythology of the soft American began to unravel, completely with the arrival of the P-51 Mustang in late 1943 and throughout 1944. This aircraft represented everything German pilots had come to fear about American industrial might. It was fast, maneuverable, beautiful in a utilitarian way, and possessed a range that made nowhere in the Reich safe. More importantly, it was produced in staggering numbers. German factories, hammered by constant bombing and strangled by resource shortages, struggled to replace losses. American factories churned out fighters by the thousands. For every Mustang shot down, 2 more appeared. For every American pilot killed, 3 more arrived from training schools in Texas, California, and Florida. Men who had logged hundreds of hours in clear skies over empty deserts. Men who had been taught to fly with an institutional thoroughness that German training programs, desperate for warm bodies to fill cockpits, could no longer match. General Lieutenant Adolf Galland, the inspector of fighters and one of the Luftwaffe's most respected combat leaders, understood the implications before most of his peers. In a meeting with Hermann Göring in early 1944, Galland laid out the grim mathematics. The Americans were achieving air superiority not through superior individual skill, but through overwhelming numbers, superior logistics, and operational depth that German forces could not counter. Göring, unwilling to accept this assessment, accused Galland of defeatism, but Galland's words would prove prophetic. By the summer of 1944, German pilots were flying obsolete aircraft, running low on fuel, and facing American fighter sweeps that hunted them over their own airfields. The hunters had become the hunted. What changed in the German perception of American pilots was not a sudden revelation of American martial virtue, but rather a forced acknowledgement of American systemic competence. Individual German pilots often remained superior in terms of raw flying skill and tactical creativity. But war is not fought by individuals. It is fought by systems of production, training, logistics, replacement, and morale. The American system was designed to win through attrition, through the application of industrial mass and organizational efficiency. German pilots found themselves fighting not just against enemy aircraft, but against an entire continental economy mobilized for war. The symbolic weight of this realization manifested in small, almost trivial observations. The quality of American flight gear, the thickness of their fleece-lined jackets, the multi-tool emergency kits found in downed aircraft, packed with chocolate, water purification tablets, maps printed on silk, and even small saws hidden in uniform buttons. Every detail spoke to a military force that assumed survival, that planned for contingency, that treated its pilots as valuable assets to be preserved rather than expendable resources to be consumed. German pilots flew in threadbare uniforms, relied on equipment that had not been updated since 1940 and operated under a command structure that increasingly viewed them as statistics rather than men. Franz Stigler, the young pilot who had sat in that operations room on that cold January morning, would have his own encounter with American humanity later that year. On December 20th, 1943, Stigler intercepted a badly damaged B-17, limping home from a raid on Bremen. The bomber's tail was nearly shot away, one engine was dead, and Stigler could see through the holes in the fuselage to the wounded crew inside. He pulled alongside, close enough to see the pilot's face, a young man, probably no older than himself, struggling to keep the aircraft aloft. Stigler had the shot. An easy kill. But something stopped him. Perhaps it was the memory of his own brother, a Luftwaffe bomber pilot killed over England. Perhaps it was a flicker of the old chivalric code that German fighter pilots still pretended guided their actions. Or perhaps it was simply the recognition that the young American was not his enemy, that they were both just men trapped in a machine of violence neither had created. Stigler escorted the B-17 to the North Sea and then turned away, letting it go. The American pilot, Charles Brown, survived the war. Decades later, the two men would find each other and become friends. This story, extraordinary as it was, revealed a deeper truth about how German pilots came to view their American adversaries. Stripped of propaganda and nationalist mythology, they saw themselves. Young men sent aloft to kill other young men operating machines of remarkable sophistication in service of causes that grew murkier with each passing month. The difference was that the Americans had a system that gave them a fighting chance to survive. The Germans, increasingly, did not. By 1945, the Luftwaffe was finished. Galland would lead a squadron of jet-powered Me-262s in the war's final months, achieving some tactical successes, but the outcome was never in doubt. American bombers ranged freely across German skies, targeting anything that moved. American fighters strafed trains, trucks, and even individual soldiers on the roads. The vaunted Luftwaffe, once the most feared air force in the world, had been ground to dust not by superior enemy courage or skill, but by an industrial and logistical machine that simply could not be stopped. In prisoner-of-war camps after the surrender, German pilots gathered in small groups, swapping stories and trying to make sense of what had happened. They spoke of the Americans with a complicated mixture of respect, resentment, and grudging admiration. The Americans had not been the soft, inexperienced amateurs German propaganda had promised. They had been competent, relentless, and backed by a nation that treated war as a problem to be solved through engineering and mass production. The German way of war, rooted in romantic notions of individual heroism and tactical brilliance, had proven inadequate against the American way, systematic, pragmatic, and utterly indifferent to aesthetic concerns about how war should be fought. In the end, what Germans really thought about American pilots in World War II evolved from dismissive contempt to wary respect, to reluctant acknowledgement of a fundamental truth, that in modern warfare the nation that can sustain its fighting forces, equip them adequately, and replace its losses will prevail over the nation that cannot. The Americans did not win the air war because they produced better pilots. They won because they produced more pilots, more aircraft, more fuel, more ammunition, and more of everything else required to sustain a continental-scale aerial campaign. The individual German pilot might have been more skilled, more experienced, more instinctively gifted in the art of aerial combat, but against an opponent who could afford to lose 10 aircraft for every one he shot down, and who would return the next day with 15 more, individual skill became almost irrelevant. The lesson was a bitter one for the Luftwaffe, schooled as it was in traditions that emphasized personal valor and martial excellence. But it was the lesson the 20th century had been teaching since the trenches of the First World War, that industrial modernity had changed the nature of warfare itself, transforming it from a contest of wills into a contest of systems. The Americans understood this instinctively, the Germans learned it too late. And in the smoking ruins of the Reich, among the wreckage of thousands of aircraft and the graves of tens of thousands of young men who had believed in their own invincibility, that understanding arrived not as enlightenment, but as epitaph.